Today we're going to go hang out with Parker Conrad. He created Rippling. He's one of the best product-focused CEOs I've ever met. Today he's going to share some of the most hard-won startup lessons that I've ever heard. And he hasn't talked about it anywhere else. Let's go check it out. This is part one. Dude, thank you so much for hanging out.
No, thanks for coming by.
So Parker, what is Rippling?
If you're a founder or CEO, one of the things you've probably noticed at your company is that there's a lot of just irreducible admin work involved in running a business. You know, it could be getting hired, it could be getting a raise, a promotion, getting married, having a kid, moving to a new address, eventually leaving the company. And each of those like life cycle events for an employee have this set of implications across all or some subset of your different business systems that today you need to handle manually and by hand. But with Rippling, we automate that end to end. So we get people added to all the right email lists, the right Slack channels. We get them a computer, all the right software's installed, they're enrolled in the right insurance benefits, get them paid correctly.
Yeah. Taking a step back, why did you start working on this to begin with? You know, why startups? Walk me through your path to here.
Actually, in 2006, I was working in LA for a pharmaceutical company, and I had a great life. I was living like 2 blocks from the beach, with my beautiful girlfriend, now wife. Had this great commute up and down PCH. Was getting like lots of like attaboys at work. But I sort of sat around and I looked at it, and at the company I was working at, you had all these different levels that you needed to sort of move up in your career, and you had to spend 2 years here and 2 years there and 2 years there and 2 years there. And at a certain point I realized that if you added up all the time it would take to sort of get anywhere in your career, I was like, I'm going to be dead before I accomplish anything. And around the same time, my roommate from college wanted to start a company. And so we did the absolute worst thing that you can do to start a startup, which is we decided we wanted to start a company, and then we sort of started looking around and thinking about what should we do? And we came up with a bunch of stuff that it turns out like nobody really wanted. We built a wiki for stock research that we ended up pivoting the company every 6 months for like 7 years. We were constantly trying to sort of like find something.
I remember because my first interaction with you was actually maybe renting space from you down the street in South of Market.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah.
At the office that's now like a restaurant.
There's this tiny little hole in the corner of the basement that
we were renting out.
Yeah.
So yes, I was at that company for 7 years of like slow grinding failure. We talked to 70 different investors. Everyone turned us down. We raised a little bit of money and we made it last and we made it last and we stretched it out and we were constantly, a month or two away from like missing payroll. And eventually my co-founder and I had a falling out, and I left the company. And I started Zenefits the day that I incorporated, basically my last day at SigFig.
Yeah, I remember. And then you applied to YC, and I remember very distinctly reading your application. The thing that really jumped out at me was that you had identified that basically regulation was coming to sort of shake up this sort of ossified industry of insurance.
So when I started Zenefits, like no one was looking at the health insurance market. I talked to a few investors. I was like, are you guys, this wasn't one of the trends that people were thinking about, but it seemed like an industry that like ran on information. There were no physical goods exchange. It was just, when you think about health insurance, you gotta enroll, they have to make payments to doctors, but it seemed like, it's like the perfect industry to be run by technology.
Totally. This is a very common thing, actually. People always ask me as an investor, what's hot, what's the trend? And my reply is always, don't ask me. I can only tell you what happened 6 months ago or 3 months ago. You have to go and find something that's happening that nobody's working on. And then,
that's right.
What is it that really speaks to you that you think is a real opportunity? And then only then can you find something that could be really big.
So the reason I started Zenefits is that I had dealt with setting up insurance for my previous company. And it was super painful. The only way to enroll people was via the fax machine. So every time we hired a new employee, I needed to stop off at Kinko's to send in a fax because like we didn't have a fax machine, and that was the only way to get someone enrolled. And so I was like, gosh, like there's got to be like a better way to kind of do this online. Being a broker, being the sort of the person that sort of helps companies get up and running with insurance and services and plans, was just this incredibly lucrative revenue stream. I mean, I'd been beaten up so much, like trying to raise money, that I had sort of given up on being able to do that. And so I figured, you know, if I can get into YC, maybe I'll be able to raise a few $100,000. And there's so much cash in being a broker that maybe I just never raise again.
Right.
That, you know, maybe it'll be a really big company, but honestly, I was thinking, man, maybe I could just be like sort of a reasonably successful tech-enabled insurance broker and like make it work as a business.
Yeah, totally. But it turned out that you were able to grow faster than I think anyone in Silicon Valley
Yeah,
had
it turns
ever
out that
seen.
that was, you know, that's the kind of business that a lot of companies want to invest in.
Yeah.
And so
a lot of investors want to invest in things that are growing massively.
When I started a company and, you know, the underlying metrics were no good, there's nothing that we could do to raise.
Yeah. In order to support that growth, you know, there's sort of two pieces to the full stack startup. It's the software that automates, and then there's the people.
Fundamentally, my view of what went wrong with Zenefits is that I made a decision very early on that we were going to scale the business faster than like our engineering team could really support it. And so we thought, you know, look, what we're going to do is not everything's in place yet, not everything's fully automated. What we're going to do is companies are doing all this admin work, we're just going to do it for them. And it was a classic YC, like do things that don't scale, which is absolutely the right way to start a company. The corollary to that, though, is eventually you have to scale them.
That's the part two.
That's part two.
And so the majority of companies actually don't get to that point.
They don't get there.
We don't hear about that enough. But now.
So what happened is we scaled out this manual process. We had a ton of people sort of doing things manually behind the scenes. And that led to a series of problems. And one of them is it actually made it a lot harder to automate things. Because once things are being done manually at scale, it's incredibly difficult to go back and automate it. The problem grows too complex. It's too hard to like build software to sort of replace what people are doing. And the second thing was that when we were doing things manually, there's always an error rate around that.
What do you say to founders when you meet them who are sort of in that situation?
People are able to accomplish like so much more than they think they can. And as a founder, it's your job to like really push the company.
Absolutely.
And to challenge them and try and sort of understand, well, why can't we do, you know, this much more?
We have a growth
than our
knob,
plan?
basically.
Yeah, like why can't we continue turning this knob?
Right.
There are certain like levels that I wouldn't turn it past. One of the mistakes we made is, you know, sort of in our efforts to kind of get demos and get companies interested in our software and schedule demos for our sales team, those started to slow down. And one of the mistakes we made is we looked at that and we said, well, it's twice as hard to schedule a demo now, so let's do twice as much of whatever we're doing to like get the number of demos. Like now we need to like hire twice as many SDRs to schedule the same number of demos. And that was a mistake. Like once things started to kind of like, you know, bend like that, we should have pulled back and said, this is actually an indication that something's going wrong. And we need to fix and address those underlying issues. And like, look, I mean, one of the perils of growing really quickly is all of this happened in the space of like 6 months.
Absolutely.
You know, where things started to slow down.
The blink of an eye.
Yeah, it was like things started to slow down, and you know, 7 months later, like, you know, I was gone. So there wasn't a lot of time to sort of course correct or adjust. But that's, I think, one of the things that we should have done. I think, you know, the other sort of red flag for us was that the gross margins in Zenefits started getting like really hairy. You know, things we had, you know, all these people doing things manually, and one of the other downsides to that, in addition to the ones we mentioned, is that you have just many fewer degrees of freedom if things start to slow down.
Yeah.
The cost structure is so high.
And that's one of the things that often in hyper growth, especially past the Series B, you're actually, growth investors really want gross margins to expand because of network effects
That's right.
or other things. And so if it goes the other way, then you kind of have a double whammy in that next round.
We didn't really get questions about gross margins in our Series A and really even our Series B. And then suddenly in Zenefits' Series C, it was the only thing that people were focused on.
So think about this earlier. That that's a pretty key thing.
Yeah. So that was actually, I mean, one of the things with Rippling, the sort of central thing that we did differently is that we kind of decided from day one there were going to be no like ops inside the company. We weren't going to do anything manually. And that meant that it had to be software end to end. We had to sort of do the hard work of like building sort of software to connect to insurance companies, to do to do our own in-house payroll system, to do all these kinds of things. The advantage of that though was that it meant that it was software end to end. It meant that it means that the error rate is non-existent. It doesn't mean that we don't make mistakes, but software errors, you make them once and then you fix it and they don't happen again. Human errors like recur continuously. It means that the financial footing of the company is much stronger. And we took it to an extreme early on in the company where for a long time we didn't even have customer support. We were just doing that. I was doing that myself. A lot of the engineering team was doing support, which meant, of course, that the product got better like really quickly.
Totally. With Rippling, you've been able to build it on bedrock, which is very powerful.
Yeah, and look, I mean, I wouldn't have been able to do that if it weren't for, quite frankly, firms like Initialized that invested a big chunk of capital in us up front. Because Rippling was, for 2 years, it was me and 40 engineers and no one else, and basically very little revenue. And we were just sort of building, we had this view from day one that we needed to build. The right answer was actually, it wasn't that we did too much at Zenefits, it was that we needed to do more. And so we needed to rebuild everything, an all-in-one payroll, benefits, and HR system like Zenefits, like Gusto. We needed to build it in a way that it worked for large companies and not just really small ones. And we needed to build sort of the entirety of like Okta and 1Password and what those guys did, and this whole sort of device management system, and that we would tackle this employee record across the entire company, and that we knew that was going to be really hard. We knew it was going to take a long time, but I think we were pretty sure that if we could build all of that in one system, that system would be different. It would be better in a really fundamental and foundational way, not just incrementally better, but like 10x better. And that if we could make that work, then we'd win, and we'd win really big. And it was only possible because we raised a seed round that you guys were the first money in, that ended up being a $17 million seed round. I mean, it was massively large upfront investment before we had really any kind of product traction, and that allowed us to really spend the time to kind of build this and build it right.
In that respect, in a way, almost a moonshot, but you knew where the moon was, and in fact, you were halfway there last time. It's almost the opposite of your first startup experience. It's like you knew that product market fit was attainable, and you just had to get there.
So Rippling was different than all of my other companies in that if you look at if I was to write out the spec on day 0 of exactly what we were going to build and sort of where we are today, it hasn't moved. 3 years later, it's moved almost not at all. And I think that's not true for most certainly not true for my other companies. I think not true for most companies. And the reason is that I think I really saw what worked at Zenefits. And I think a lot of people misunderstood why Zenefits worked when it was working, because people thought Zenefits was online health insurance. Really, you need one system that handles everything. It's a more foundational piece of business software that manages one employee record across every business system in your company.
I love that. I mean, that's one of the biggest problems that a lot of founders face, is that they actually put the engineering ahead of the business need, ahead of the actual problem people have. And in the end, you're sort of a solution in search of a problem. And that's the opposite of how you've been able to build Rippling.
Yeah. Well, I mean, as you know, that's that's the YC way.
Yeah,
It's starting with a problem that you have and looking for the right way to solve it rather than, a technology and searching for what it can solve.
Yeah, make something people want, do unscalable things, and then the big lesson here is part 2, actually scale it,
Yeah,
which you've been able to do.